Before us now is the nomination of Rod Rosenstein to be the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. The Deputy Attorney General oversees the day-to-day operations of the Department of Justice. In any circumstance, this is an important position that requires a nominee with experience, independence, management skill, and good judgment. Especially true today. Many of us question whether Attorney General Sessions was the right person to be the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States of America at this moment in history. Unfortunately, many of the actions of the new Attorney General since he was confirmed have not erased these concerns. The Attorney General has already begun making dramatic changes at the Justice Department, including critical issues like criminal justice, civil rights, immigration, and funding for crime prevention. Just last week, Attorney General Sessions disparaged a federal judge from Hawaii who issued an order blocking the Trump administration's Muslim travel ban. The Attorney General Sessions said, and I quote, "I really am amazed that a judge sitting on an island in the Pacific can issue an order that stops the President of the United States from what appears to be clearly his statutory and constitutional power," end of quote. Senator Mazie Hirono, my colleague on the Senate Judiciary Committee and the junior senator from Hawaii, pointed out that Hawaii was granted statehood in 1959 and called the Attorney General's comments insulting and prejudiced. Also last week, Attorney General Sessions called into question the status of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, also known as DACA. When asked about DACA, Attorney General Sessions said, and I quote, "We can't promise people who are here unlawfully that they're not going to be deported," end of quote. Mr. President, that's exactly what DACA does. It is a commitment to young people who were brought to the United States as children and grew up in our country that they'll be protected from deportation on a temporary, renewable basis. And Attorney General Sessions' statement is contrary to his own administration's policy, as established by President Trump and Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly, who have primary responsibility for immigration enforcement. The last confirmed nominee for Deputy Attorney General was Sally Yates, veteran prosecutor, U.S. Attorney from Georgia. Ms. Yates displayed sound judgment as Deputy Attorney General. She was unafraid to speak truth to power. Ms. Yates became the acting Attorney General at the end of the Obama administration. And when President Trump signed his unconstitutional Muslim ban executive order on January 27, Sally Yates told the White House she could not defend the order in court because she was not convinced it was lawful. Ms. Yates was then fired by President Trump for disagreeing with him. However, multiple federal courts agreed with Ms. Yates' position and blocked this unconstitutional executive order. Time and history have proven Ms. Yates correct. We need a Deputy Attorney General like Sally Yates, highly competent, with the independence to say no to the President and to the Attorney General when necessary. Rod Rosenstein has served as U.S. Attorney for the District of Maryland since 2005, under both Democratic and Republican presidents. I do not question his experience or his competence. As a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, I look closely at his nomination. I asked him many questions in the hearing, sent some follow-up letters, and I appreciate he's been forthcoming in his responses. Mr. Rosenstein has pledged to be an independent voice and has committed that he will not recommend any changes in Justice Department policy until he evaluates it, discusses it with appropriate officials, and determines that a change is warranted. I expect he'll be confirmed, and upon confirmation, Mr. Rosenstein will immediately be tasked with responsibility over critically important issues where he'll need to display both sound judgment and independence. Four come to mind. The first is the ongoing investigation into Russia's efforts to interfere with the 2016 presidential election to help the Trump campaign. What Russia did in our election last year was a cyber act of war against our democracy. It is imperative that we get to the bottom of what happened to make sure it never happens again. I've called for an independent, bipartisan investigation into Russia's election interference. The Republican majority in the House and Senate have resisted this call. Instead, Republicans in Congress have referred this matter to the intelligence committees of both houses, perhaps hoping that it will fade away behind closed doors. I hope the intelligence committees will step up and conduct an investigation worthy of the importance of this issue. But when it comes to potential criminal acts involving Russia's election interference, the responsibility to investigate falls solely on the Justice Department. Attorney General Sessions has had to recuse himself from the investigation because of his work for the Trump campaign and his failure to disclose his contacts with Russian officials. That means the Deputy Attorney General now has the responsibility over this investigation. It's incumbent on Mr. Rosenstein to ensure this investigation is conducted with independence, diligence, and integrity. I believe appointing a special counsel is the best way to ensure this. I hope he'll make that appointment. If Mr. Rosenstein does not appoint a special counsel, the spotlight will be on him personally to make sure the investigation is conducted properly, no matter where it leads. I hope he exercises good judgment. This investigation is too important to get wrong. The second issue that will require independence and good judgment for the Deputy Attorney General is the Justice Department's threat to withhold federal funding to prevent violence across America, including the city of Chicago. The Trump administration's message has been confusing, to say the least, when it comes to federal efforts to prevent violence. On the one hand, President Trump in the middle of the night tweets, "Chicago needs help, send in the feds." But then the administration threatens to cut off critical funding for violence prevention under programs like BURN, JAG, unless cities agree to turn their local police departments into deportation forces. It's pretty obvious. Cutting off federal violence prevention funding will hurt the cause of violence prevention. Don't take my word for it. Ask any law enforcement leader. Listen to what the International Association of Chiefs of Police said, and I quote, "Penalizing communities by withholding assistance funding to law enforcement agencies and other critical programs is counterproductive to our shared mission of reducing violent crime and keeping communities safe." It's no secret the Attorney General is fixated on immigration, but we need the Deputy Attorney General to ensure this fixation does not undermine the important ways the Justice Department and local law enforcement cooperate to reduce violent crime. This administration can't call itself a law and order administration and then do something like cut the funds for violence prevention when police chiefs across America say that is just wrong. The third area of critical importance is criminal justice policy. Today, our federal prisons are 30% over capacity, and runaway prison expenditures are undermining important public safety priorities, like crime prevention, drug courts, and addiction treatment. The largest increase in federal prison population has been nonviolent drug offenders who are then separated from their families for years on end as a result of inflexible mandatory minimum sentences. This has a destructive effect on communities and erodes faith in America in our criminal justice system. Congress needs to pass legislation to reform our federal drug sentencing laws, but the Justice Department's policies for nonviolent drug offenses also can help. Under the Obama administration, the Smart on Crime initiative directed federal prosecutors to reserve stiff mandatory minimum sentences for individuals convicted of serious offenses. This initiative has been very effective in focusing the department's limited resources on the worst offenders and assuring that people convicted of low-level, nonviolent offenses are not subjected to these same mandatory minimum penalties. Attorney General Sessions has signaled that he wants to eliminate that Smart on Crime initiative, and certainly those of us who listen to his opposition to criminal sentencing reform are not surprised. But as Deputy Attorney General, Mr. Rosenstein will chair a task force on crime reduction and public safety that's been established by the President. This gives him an important voice. I hope he'll work to ensure the department's charging policy reserves stiff mandatory sentences for only serious violent offenders. Mr. Rosenstein will also be responsible for determining the fate of the Justice Department's efforts to work constructively with state and local law enforcement to protect civil rights and improve community police relations. In particular, Mr. Rosenstein should continue negotiations to pursue police reform in Chicago, backed up by an enforceable consent decree. The former U.S. Attorney in Chicago, Zach Farden, felt strongly a consent decree was needed to correct the systemic problems we face. Mr. Rosenstein has shown more openness to using consent decrees than Attorney General Sessions, who has an ideological, personal hostility toward them. I hope Mr. Rosenstein will look carefully at this issue in Chicago and respect the judgment of Mr. Farden and the career DOJ DOJ professionals who spent over a year investigating this matter. Mr. Rosenstein also be responsible for reining in the Attorney General's worst instincts on immigration. It is no surprise to any member of this chamber that when the issue of immigration came to the floor, the leading opponent on immigration reform was Senator Sessions of Alabama. I believe he offered 100 amendments to the immigration reform bill that passed the United States Senate. He has spoken out over and over again of his opposition to immigration reform. The Attorney General has already directed federal prosecutors across the country to make immigration cases a higher priority and look for opportunities to bring serious felony charges against those who cross the border without authorization. Federal prosecutors understand this is not the right approach. Listen to Paul Charlton, U.S. Attorney from Arizona under the Bush administration. According to him, this new directive will overburden the federal courts already struggling to handle the volume of immigration cases. He said, and I quote, "Prosecution and incarceration do not adequately address the real need, which is reform of the immigration laws." Let me conclude. I've seen the Democratic leader on the floor. There are a number of critical issues that will require sound judgment and leadership from the next Deputy Attorney General. I hope Mr. Rosenstein will approach these issues with professionalism and integrity that has earned him bipartisan praise as U.S. Attorney in Maryland. And I hope he'll be willing to speak truth to power and to stand up to the President and Attorney General if necessary. I'll support Mr. Rosenstein's nomination. I hope we can work together constructively on the important matters facing the Department of Justice